All right, good morning, everybody. So, yeah, they like to make me nice and nervous by recording me and putting it online. So if I mess up, you guys can hear it over and over and over again. So I thank you guys all for coming out. Just tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name's Nicole Brandenburg. I work for Century 21 Judge Fight Property Management Company. I've worked there for about 7 years. Before I worked there, I worked for Capital One Auto Finance in the underwriting and funding department, and that's where a lot of my knowledge of the credit bureaus and risk profiling, which is some of what I'm going to talk about today, that's a lot of where that knowledge comes from. I am a property manager with Century 21. Like I said, I've been there for about 7 years, and I've been doing some trainings like this within the company for a while, and I'm just blessed to have this opportunity to come and talk to you guys about it. Before I get started, just to let you guys know, if you have any questions, if you'll hold them till after the presentation, I'll be happy to stay here and answer any questions that anybody has. That way anybody who needs to leave can leave when the presentation's over and they don't have to stay forever. All right, with that, I will get started. Today what I'm going to talk about is, like the title says, staying legal with your rental application process. I'm going to talk about the application process and the verifications and the importance of that. I'm also going to talk about what to look for in the credit bureau and red flags that you need to keep your eyes out for. Also, risk profiling to help you make better decisions on your applications, and how to handle adverse action and the Dodd-Frank that came out. So first, I want to talk about the application process. I think sometimes we as agents don't realize the importance of this, but what we need to remember is that we work for the owner. It's our job to protect that owner as much as possible, the owner of the property. So one thing we need to keep in mind as agents is consistency is the key. We need to make sure we're processing every application the same way every time. And this is to protect us from federal fair housing. If you're not processing applications the same way every time, you're putting yourself at risk of the appearance of discrimination. You make exceptions for one person over another. So definitely, if you remember nothing else from today, make sure you do everything the same way every time. By doing a thorough application process every time, you can help protect your owner from evictions and damages later on down the line. Just think about how important it is. I will tell you that every time I interview with somebody who wants to hire us for property management services, the 2 questions I get asked, number 1 are, what do you charge? And number 2 is, how do you screen for applicants? What do you look for? And how specific are you? One of the things I want to talk about is documenting your screening criteria. I know a lot of people do not do this. We as a company have a 2-page cover sheet that we send with all of our applications. It has all of our screening criteria. Afterwards, if any of you would like a copy of that to use as a point of reference, if you want to come give me your business card, I'd be happy to share that with you. You can take it and modify it however you like. Some examples of some of what you'll find on there is if you're going to have a minimum credit score or minimum credit criteria that you are not going to allow, criminal criteria that you will not approve, rental, income, all those different things. You want to basically document what your minimum criteria that you will and won't allow. That helps protect you in the case that people want to come back and say you decline them. A lot of people want to come back and throw a big fit, say you didn't treat them fairly, say if you had told them this up front, they wouldn't have applied. Well, we're not mind readers and we don't know what's going to come up on their credit. But at least if you have a baseline to give them, you're protecting yourself on the back end. The other thing I want to talk about is using the TAR forms. Use what's already available to you. TAR has some great forms for the application, and it already has the signatures and everything that you need to get. Use the TAR application form. Make sure you get signatures on every page. Make sure it's fully filled out. Don't let them turn in an incomplete application, and absolutely don't fax off a rental and employment verification unless you have their signature on that form. That protects you, making sure you have the right to request that information, and it's going to make it easier for you to get that information from the employer and from the landlord if you've already got it signed by our applicant. And lastly, don't skip out on the verifications. Sometimes it's time-consuming, yes, to chase down a landlord, to chase down an employer. Don't skip on those verifications. They are important, and getting them in writing protects you In the end, it protects your owner as well. But I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but it's happened to me. An owner approved somebody. 6 months, 8 months down the line, they turn out to be a horrible tenant. They don't pay their rent, whatever. All of a sudden, your owner is going to come back to you and say, well, I should never have approved them. I didn't want to approve them. Or, you didn't tell me the truth, whatever. If you have this stuff in writing where you got it from their employer, from their landlord, you got good verifications on them, and something goes bad with them, you've protected yourself as well. All right, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the verifications, kind of like what I was just talking about here. I'm going to get to credit in a minute. I'm going to talk about everything else right now. The first thing in terms of criminal record, you need to decide what you're comfortable with or what your owner's comfortable with. But what I recommend is that you say absolutely no way to felonies, drug charges, sex offenses, or crimes involving children. Violent crimes as well, but violent crimes are almost always going to fall under felonies, right? So if you stick to no felonies, you're going to protect yourself. And with drug charges, you may want to lump that into felonies, or you may want to break that up. That just depends on what you're comfortable with. I manage a lot of houses in Denton. Let's be honest, a lot of people in Denton have some minor drug charges. Sometimes with the misdemeanors, my owners are okay with that. Find out what you and your owner are comfortable with, but I definitely suggest that you avoid felonies. And obviously, like I said, the sex offenses and the crimes involving children, you have to consider also the people who live around the property that you're managing. You want to make sure that you're putting good people in there that are not going to bring undesirable people around or cause damage to your property. Next thing on the rental history, this is probably one of the most important things right next to the credit bureau. Absolutely say no to people with evictions or money owed to a landlord. If they owe money to somebody else, the chances that they're going to end up owing money to you or to your owner for some reason are pretty high. Now, every now and then, I will make exceptions if it's over a certain amount of years old, maybe 5, 6 years old, and they have, consistent good rental history since then. But typically, as a policy, it's the wisest thing is to just say no. People always have some kind of sob story. You don't want to be their next one, okay? The other thing you want to be looking for is bounce checks, late payments, and damages. You may want to decline for that as well, or you may want to just charge additional deposit. It's going to depend on the severity of it. Let's say you get 2 years rental history with somebody and they bounced the check one time and paid it off. It's maybe not that big of a deal. But if they've been late every other month since they moved in there, chances are they're going to be late when it comes to paying you. So just use, a little bit of common sense there when you're thinking about whether or not you want to decline form or ask for additional deposit. I would say when you're asking for additional deposit, if you feel it's severe enough for that, you want to at least ask for a 2-month security deposit. It takes almost a month to get somebody out of a property when you're evicting them. So you're talking about a month of lost rent and another month of probably getting it re-rented. So you want at least 2 months to cover your loss there. Unemployment. This one's also a big one. We've started to see a trend lately at my company. We manage approximately 1,700 houses, so we do a lot of applications. We've noticed a trend lately where people give us a paycheck stub, a recent paycheck stub, and 2-3 months down the line when we're evicting them, we find out they had lost their job right as they applied. Don't think people will not do that to you. They absolutely will out of desperation. If they've got to get into a place, they will give you a paycheck stub, rent a house really quickly before they know they can't get one, and then you're going to be left high and dry. Verify their employment directly with their employer. Don't just rely on paycheck stubs. The other thing to think about is when they're putting their boss or their verification contact on there, try to see if you can look them up. If it's a big enough company, try to look up an HR department. Try to make sure when you call you feel like you're getting a legitimate office. They will give you numbers for people that are their friends, give you a cell phone number. Yeah, so-and-so works for me, he's a great employee. Okay, try to get that in writing if you can, and if not, definitely make sure you feel like you've done your best to get a legitimate contact at the employer. And then when it comes to income, make sure you're using verifiable documentation, okay? Getting paycheck stubs. If they're self-employed, get their tax returns or at least a 1099 that you know is legit. Bank statements are not something I like to rely on unless you look at somebody's bank statement and you can see for the last year they've had $40,000 in their bank account, and maybe you're comfortable with that. Don't let them tell you, well, I haven't filed my taxes for a couple of years. Well, you probably have bigger problems coming your way from the federal government when they figure that out. If they haven't filed their most recent year, that's probably not as big of an issue, but they should at least have the year before that, and they should be able to give you 1099s or some kind of documentation. Don't back down on that. Self-employed people can be a big risk. They can also be great tenants. You just need to make sure that you do the work up front. The other thing on the income front is that you want to make sure the minimum income requirement is at least 3 times the monthly rent. I've been doing this for a really, really long time, and I will tell you that statistically, when we have made exceptions for people that make less than 3 times the monthly rent, it almost always goes bad. If somebody doesn't make at least $3,000 and $1,000 a month rental, chances are they're going to have trouble paying their rent. Think about it realistically. If you only made $1,800 or $2,000 a month and your rent was $1,000, it would be hard for you at the end of the month to get through with all of your bills. Okay? You can be stricter than that. I personally wouldn't recommend that, because then you're going to start limiting a lot of good people in the middle class income range. So just definitely make sure that you don't make an exception. That would be an example of something you'd want to put on your criteria that you would not want to make exceptions for. Also, when you're getting certain kinds of other income like Social Security or retirement, sometimes you can use bank statements for those types of income. I would definitely recommend that you get at least 6 months of bank statements so that you can see a consistent deposit every month. I want to make sure that they didn't just get a big payment and then they're not getting anything else for pensions and things like that.
How do you treat child support?
Child support, I typically like to see a divorce decree and bank statements. If they're having trouble producing the divorce decree because it's in a box somewhere or it's changed, usually you can still get them to get an updated support order, but definitely a ton of bank statements if it's being deposited by the Attorney General. If it's being deposited by the person himself, the father or the mother themselves, into the bank account direct, then you're kind of taking a risk there. If it's not court ordered, that means they can stop paying it. Okay, so if it's not court ordered and that person needs that income to qualify, I would probably recommend you not do that. If it's being deposited by the Attorney General into the bank account, you'll be able to tell. It'll say Texas OAG is what it will say on the bank statements usually. Then it's probably a safe bet that they're going to keep getting it. If that non-custodial parent knows that the AG is watching them, if they don't pay, it's automatically being taken from their paycheck, you're probably going to be okay. Obviously, stuff happens, people lose their jobs. You can't do anything to avoid that. All you can do is make sure that the income was legitimate from the start.
But you said you want the divorce decree to
The support order, it doesn't necessarily need to be the divorce decree. Yeah, just at least the support order portion of it. If they can't get that, but they can produce you, 6 or 9 months of bank statements and you can see biweekly or weekly deposits or whatever it is, that's probably okay. If you see it's coming from the OAG, then you know there's a support order. The AG does not get involved unless there's a support order. So if you can see that, then that's probably just as good. Most people will be able to give you their support order because that's kind of something you want to keep on file. All right, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is the credit bureau. This is probably one of the most important parts of the application process, and a lot of people overlook this part of it. Credit bureau is confusing. It contains a lot of information, a lot of things you don't know how to read. One of the things I want to caution you about is going off of the credit score alone. Credit scores can be misleading. They can make things look better than they are, and they can make things look worse than they are. Most people in today's economy right now are in the 6s. Once upon a time, the 6s were kind of a bad place to be. A lot of people are in the 6s now because getting over a 700 has become more difficult with the economy. Obviously, if you see somebody over 700, that's great. You don't even need to look twice on their credit bureau. Everything on there is going to be good if they're over 700. There are a lot of good folks in the 6s, but when you start looking at their credit, you will start seeing that there's absolutely nothing wrong with their credit. Credit scores are based off of history, length of history as well. So you're going to see people in the low to mid 6s that maybe just haven't had a lot of credit history. Maybe that's why their score's so low. Maybe they've had a lot of debt. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that score. So I would caution you against just using the score to make your decision. It would be a lot more beneficial to you if you look at each individual line item and make your decision. So when you're looking at the credit bureau, there's 3 sections that you want to focus on. The first one is the personal information section. That's at the top. That's where it says the name, the address, all that information. One of the key things to be looking for there is addresses that show up on the credit bureau that are not listed on their application. The application only gives them 2 spots, but that at least should go back 2 years, if not more. Look and see if during that time period, the last 2 to 3 years that you see reflected on their application, if you see addresses show up on their credit bureau that are not on that application, if the date of the address on the credit bureau is recent, that may be something that you may want to keep an eye on. That could mean that they've lived somewhere that they're not telling you about. Addresses can show up on a credit bureau for a number of reasons. Typically, it's because they've told some creditor or on some credit application that they live at this address. Now, they can be mistakes, so it shouldn't be the be-all, end-all on your decision. It's just definitely something that you should pay attention for, especially if you see anything else on the application that feels a little sketchy to you. On the next section, the public records, this is going to be one of the biggest sections you definitely want to pay attention to. Under public records, you're going to find bankruptcies, tax liens, and court judgments. On bankruptcies, a lot of people do not understand how big of a risk an open bankruptcy is to you. I recommend you absolutely do not rent to anybody with an open bankruptcy, no matter how nice of a person they seem. Bankruptcies can drag your rental property into the process. Technically, a renter should not be able to include a lease in a bankruptcy. However, they can use a bankruptcy to stave off an eviction. They can go before a judge, get a hold on your eviction, and it can drag out for months and months. And there's not a thing you can do about it. You cannot evict them if that judge puts a hold on there. So if you rent to somebody with an open bankruptcy, you are taking on a very big risk. I don't even recommend doing it with extra deposit because they can drag it out more than 3 months, and there goes that 3 months of deposit you collected, and you can't get rid of them. Eventually you can get rid of them, but it does take quite a lot of time, and by that point your owner will be broke. Also, keep an eye out for bankruptcies that have the status dismissed. There's 2 statuses, discharged and dismissed. Discharged means they completed the program and they're done with the bankruptcy. It's closed. They went all the way through with whatever the steps of the bankruptcy court were. Dismissed means they did not follow through. Either they were kicked out of the program for not complying, or they opted not to finish the bankruptcy. The risk with that is they can refile. On a discharge bankruptcy, depending on the type of the bankruptcy, it depends on how long until they can refile. It's typically at least 2 years. Some of them are a little bit longer. So if somebody's got a recently discharged bankruptcy, they can't refile for at least a couple of years. So you're probably not going to have to worry about them refiling. You may want to ask for extra deposit, given that they have a credit risk, having just come out of a bankruptcy. But you're at least not going to need to be worried about the chances of them refiling anytime soon. However, if it's dismissed, and if it's recently dismissed, it is quite possible that they are planning to rent the house and then file again. If it's been dismissed for many years and their history since then is good, it might be something you may want to overlook or ask for extra deposit on. But just be very, very cautious when you see recently dismissed bankruptcies. Tax liens are not as big of a risk, but there's still something to pay attention to. If somebody has a significant amount of tax liens, they clearly have an issue with paying taxes. If you see a tax lien and a foreclosure around the same time, you know, that's obviously they had a major problem there. But if you see a history of repeated tax liens, that's a history of a repeated problem. It's not necessarily a reason for decline, but it might be a reason for extra deposit. And the last thing in the public records you want to look at is court judgments. This is where you're going to find landlords. This is also where you're going to find credit card companies, basically anybody else who sued the applicant. You're going to find it there. Look at who the plaintiff is. That will tell you who the person suing was. If you're not sure, you can request more information from the applicant. But if you see a landlord name, a realtor, anything, apartment complex, anything like that, that means that they lost in eviction court and they have a judgment against them. Now, sometimes people get to that point, they pay, they stay in the property, and the judgment never gets released at the court. They should be able to go and bring you back documentation of that. But then, same thing, they clearly got far enough along with the landlord that they had to go to court. So there again, that's something you might not want to approve. The last thing is the trade lines. This is the section at the bottom where it lists the creditor and the payment history. This is definitely where I recommend you spend the most time looking when you don't see anything in the public records that immediately scare you away. Take a look at the trade lines. You don't have to spend an hour reading every line, But look at the individual trade lines and look at their history. Look and see, do they have any foreclosures? Do they have any car repos? Credit bureaus list things mortgage first, and then installment loans, and then revolving credit, always in that order. So you're going to sort of be going the most important down to the least important on their credit bureau. That's the way the credit bureaus run, every bureau, no matter what. So if there are going to be foreclosures, you're going to find them in the first couple of listings. You'll see it. It'll say on there, foreclosure proceedings started. It'll say reclaimed collateral. That means repo or foreclosure if we're talking about a mortgage. Okay, so definitely keep an eye out for that. Given our economy right now, right, we're seeing a lot of foreclosures. I don't recommend that you automatically decline for foreclosures. You're going to want to take it situation by situation. Read what they have to say on their application, look at their job history, and then look at their trade lines and see what have they done since that foreclosure. Okay, so that leads me to the next thing, which is the open and status dates. The Bureau will say on the trade line, open date and status date, right next to where it says creditor. Look at those dates, and that will tell you when the account was open, and that will tell you when the last status of it, which would be when the last payment was made or when the last activity to the account was. That will help tell you how long ago something has happened. Sometimes the creditors don't follow through with completely closing out something on a credit bureau and it's still kind of running open. But if you can look and see that it's from status dates from 2007, okay, well that's 5 years ago. That might be something that you're willing to overlook. If it's really, really recent, then obviously it's something you need to pay attention to. And that goes for every type of credit that you see on there. Look at the status dates to tell you how recent they are. Look at the current balance and see, did they let it get behind, but did they pay it off, and have they not used it for a couple of years in the terms of credit cards, okay? And look at their delinquency history. Credit bureaus typically report 7 years, although quite a few times you will find stuff even older than 7 years. I wouldn't worry about going back that far. 7 years is quite enough history. However, look and see, in 7 years, have they never stayed consistently on time with anything? Probably not somebody you want to rent to, or probably somebody you want to ask for extra deposit. If they had something happen to them, and then since then things have been good, okay, well they're demonstrating to you good choices. But if for 7 years they've never paid a bill on time, you need to be concerned, okay? Because it's only a matter of time before they get swallowed alive by that. A couple of things to look for, red flags in terms of the application and the credit bureau as a whole. Look out for living with family, okay? Lots of good people are living with family. I'm not going to say you should decline for that, but a lot of times they're, quote, living with family because they're not wanting to tell you about something. Maybe they just got evicted and it's not on their credit yet. Maybe they haven't been very good with their bills and couldn't afford to live on their own. Just watch those closely. Okay, because a lot of times what you're going to find is let's say it's about 50-50. Some of them, maybe they just relocated here and they were living with their family for a couple of months until they could get their family into a home. Okay, those people's credit and history prior to that move should check out. And if it does, then it probably is really what it seems, okay? But if it doesn't, or they've been living with their mom for 2 years, or just all of a sudden they just moved out and started living with mom for no reason, you need to look at that closely. That leads me to the one there where it says unpaid utilities. That kind of goes along with living with family. If they tell you they've been living with mom because, oh, their lease was up and they couldn't find a new house, or whatever reason they give, and you look on their credit bureau and 1 month ago they didn't pay 4 utility companies, guess what? Something didn't go right with their last landlord, and that's why they're living with mom, okay? Or maybe they're still living there and they're about to be evicted, and that's why they're telling you they live with mom. The other thing about living with family is if they're trying to tell you they pay rent there and they want to use that as rental history, keep in mind your verification's only as good as the person you're talking to, which is mom, sister, brother, who wants to help this person get out of their house. Okay, so yeah, exactly. So they want whoever that is living with them out as quickly as possible, and they're going to tell you they're the best people ever. Okay, if we're talking about young people, that's different. If they're 18, 19, 20, obviously they've always been living with mom. That's a little bit different. And then along those lines, beware of landlords and employers who have the same last name. If they live with mom and work for dad, or especially if they don't tell you that they work for a family business and you start noticing everybody's last name is Smith, okay, that's something to be concerned about. It's kind of the same thing as what I just said. If their boss is family, they're going to tell you they pay them $1 million and they're a golden employee and they would never fire them. Get verifiable documentation of income in that case. Get paycheck stubs if they work for a large company. Get tax returns, okay? Make sure they're really being paid what that person says they're being paid, okay? Because that family member is going to help them get a house and they're going to write whatever they want, and there's nobody who can do anything about that if that person owns the company. And the last thing to look at on the credit bureau is the responsibility of the accounts. When you're looking at the trade lines, on the right-hand side, it will say, it will have a number, and it will, or a letter, I'm sorry, and it will say I or J or A, or sometimes it will say individual, joint, or authorized. If it doesn't, that's what those letters stand for. And if it says individual, then that means that's an individual credit item, meaning you went and got a credit card, it's yours and yours alone, there's nobody else's on it. If it has a J, that means there's joint applicants, like in married couples. That can be a red flag to you. If they tell you that well, they went through a divorce and their ex didn't help them with anything, but all the joint accounts are current and all the individual accounts are not, maybe that's not the situation there. If they really did get a divorce and the spouse paid for all the joint things and they didn't pay for any of their own stuff, you're taking on the risk there. Okay, so just that can be a little helpful factor to help you figure out if their story is truthful. That leads me to risk profiling. This is something that you can use to help make a decision when you're on the fence. If you've got a Class A application with perfect credit and great rental history and a great job, you don't need to do this, okay? But your experiences are probably going to be a lot like mine. 90% of the applications I'm getting are not Class A, okay? They're just not slam dunk in the basket applications. In those cases, you can use one of these three ways, whichever one is applicable at the time, to help you decide if this person is a risk that's greater than what you want to take, okay? And this is great with your owners because you can pick one of these and figure out which one you think works best with your owner's thinking. The first one is based off their payment history. People pay things in the order of the greatest importance to them, and that typically is mortgage or rent. Most likely rent more than mortgage, given the foreclosure situation these days. The bottom line is people have to have a roof over their head at the end of the day. They're going to pay that before they pay anything else. The next thing is going to be cars. People have got to have a car to get to work. They're going to pay their car bill. Then after that, everything, it kind of comes down to the individual person, but it tends to be a tie between utilities and collateral loans. Collateral loans are loans that are secured by a piece of collateral that the person doesn't want to lose if they don't make the payment. They're more likely to pay that than they are to pay a credit card because you can't garnish wages in the state of Texas. So if somebody sues them, there's nothing they can do to get a dime out of that person. So if they're going to let something go, they're going to let go the person who can't really do anything to them but sue them. So look and see, does their payment history show that they have valued the most important items? If you see that they have got some credit cards they've had trouble with, but they've always paid their cars faithfully on time, and their rental history or their mortgage history is really good, recreational vehicles or collateral loans or installment loans, they've paid those well. That's important. I wouldn't put too much focus on student loans just because a lot of people don't pay them. That's just the reality. And also medical. Medical is almost always incorrect when you see it on a person's credit bureau. If you're in a payment plan with a medical company, they will go ahead and report it to your credit. They just don't care. So I personally pay very little attention to medical. In fact, sometimes the medical can verify a story if they tell you that they ran into some financial trouble because they had a hard birth or an illness, and the medical bills, you see a ton of medical bills, that probably is telling you that their story is the truth, okay? The next way you can do it is based on debt to income ratio. This is kind of like what the mortgage companies do. How you would do that is you would take their total monthly payments that they're responsible for every month and divide that by their total monthly income. Whatever is left over, is that enough to cover your rent and utilities and groceries and everything else that that person needs for their family to survive? If it's over probably 40%, it's probably not. Now, the mortgage companies range anywhere from 36 to 41. Some go as high as 50. I didn't list a number in here because it's kind of up to your comfortability level. Maybe gauge it based off the type of property that you're renting. The higher the debt that they owe on a monthly basis, the greater the risk they're going to get in over their heads and somebody's not going to get paid. You don't want to be that person that doesn't get paid. If you have somebody who has mediocre credit and you can't decide if one way or the other, look and see what their monthly obligations are. If they're really, really high, that person is pushing their luck. They're living beyond their means. The last way you can do it is profiling based on their credit history. This is kind of what I was referring to earlier. Do the trade lines match their story? Like what I was saying with the medical. If they told you they had a medical problem, you see medical bills. That lines up. They told you they lost their job in 2008, had a foreclosure, got behind on some stuff, but since then have been doing really good. If you look at the status dates and everything since then is paid current, they're telling you the truth. They have really been taking steps to improve. But if they tell you, oh, I lost my job and I've been on track since then, and they still haven't paid anything on time since then, haven't made any steps towards paying anything on time, then their credit bureau is showing you the lie that they're trying to tell you. The more the risk, the more likely you are to need to decline or to ask for additional deposit. Double and triple deposit is typically what you're going to want to ask for. It's going to depend on the level of risk. If you're taking on somebody who has a lot of recent, within the last 1 to 2 years of problems, you're probably going to want to go for the higher. If it's been a couple of years, if they have a better paying job, if they're starting to show steps of recovery, maybe you only get double. You'll have to make that decision based off of the individual application. The last thing that's really important that a lot of agents don't know about is adverse action. When you decline somebody, obviously I think probably most of you know, you have to send them a letter that you're declining them. However, the new adverse action laws say you have to send them a letter if you take any adverse action, okay? And that's even if you approve them. If you require a cosigner because of a lack of history or a problem with the history, if you require a longer lease, if you require more deposit, if you change the rent amount, if you change anything from the original advertisement of your property due to something negative that you see in the application, the credit bureau, the rental history, anything, you have to send them an adverse action letter. If you don't do this, you are in big trouble. There's already a TAR form for it. You don't even have to make it up. Just print it out and use it. It has all the blanks, everything that you need to fill that out. Make sure you get that to them. What the law says is you must send it as quickly as possible after the adverse action is taken. If I were you, I would have it out the door within 24 to 48 hours. It's not that complicated. It'll take you 5 minutes. I would personally suggest you send it certified in regular mail. I like certified mail because even if they don't pick it up, I have proof I sent it. Okay, and that protects you. The other thing is the Dodd-Frank Act says that anytime you use credit score, the actual numerical score, in making your decision, you must disclose the score. The TAR Form 2212 that I have listed here does have a space for the credit disclosure as well. So if you are using the actual numerical score, you need to make sure that you disclose it in accordance with the law and with that form. I personally, as I said earlier, don't recommend that you go off of just the credit score. I think it's better if you use multiple things. Just definitely make sure that you're sending that form for any adverse action. If you're not sure, but you think you changed something based off of that person, send an adverse action letter. Protect yourself. And, you know, like I said, it doesn't have to be for a decline. It can be for an approval. Yes, ma'am?
So if you were to come in and say, we're going to require 3 months advance rent, that needs to be stated and why?
Yes, you would want to use the adverse action letter. Anything that you're changing from what you advertised, you have got to send an adverse action letter. Even if they're agreeable to it, doesn't matter. Law says you have to notify them you took adverse action against them. Okay. All right, so basically what we talked about today is the application process and the importance of that, making sure you're following through with all of your verifications, making sure you're taking time to review the credit bureau. Use that for the great tool that it is. There is so much information that you can get from the credit bureau. Make sure you're not skipping over that. Definitely make sure that you're looking out for those red flags. Protect your owner. Be wise and be looking for some of those things that are right there in front of you if you just take the time to look. And lastly, don't forget to send the adverse action. You've taken all these steps to do a great application process. Don't get yourself in trouble in the end by not sending the letter. All right, if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Make sure that you repeat the questions for the day.
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. Okay, go ahead.
If you're renting, let's say duplexes or apartments, like in the TCU area, or PTA, and you're requiring a guarantor, but you, in your on your disclosure page on the front, your requirements page of the application, you don't require that of anybody but a couple of different properties, and you tell them that up front, do you still recommend giving them the adverse action form?
Okay, so the question is, if you are requiring co-signers or guarantors for certain properties and you have that disclosed on your criteria sheet, should you still send an adverse action letter? Is that the correct? You don't have it disclosed. Whether you do or don't, I would send it because it's still an adverse action that you're only requiring of a specific group of people. So whether you disclose you're going to require it or not, I would, just to protect yourself. More information is always better. Anybody else?
I have another question. Is there one system better for checking than others? I know as realtors we have a system through TAR that we can check the credit, but is there anything
For credit checks?
yeah, for the credit checks?
Okay, so the question is there one system better than another for credit checks? There are a lot of choices. MetroTex offers one. You can go to their website. I have seen sample credit bureaus without personal information on them. I would recommend you use the MetroTex resource. I would recommend you use one that doesn't give you a letter score. Some of them review the application and then just give you an A+ or a B or a C. They don't let you actually see the trade lines and the individual items. I don't recommend that because you're leaning on somebody else to make that decision whether or not they think it's an A, B, C, or a D, and they're kind of taking the power out of your hands. There are a lot of services that do that. I personally like to be able to look at everything myself and mold that person and decide what I think based off of their history. And if you're not being able to see that, then you're limiting yourself. But I would recommend the MetroTex service because they allow you to see the credit bureaus. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
What is the average length of time that it takes you to qualify or disqualify somebody?
Okay, so the question is, what is the average length of time it takes to qualify somebody? Try to do it as quickly as possible. The longer that you wait, the more you put yourself at the risk of the person feeling like you are dragging your feet. The more mad people will get, especially if you have multiple applications. Do them as quickly as possible and make sure that your communication is frequent, because if somebody thinks that you're dragging your feet in order for somebody else, they would probably have a case to come against you.
But if you're going to be qualifying based on credit, based on employers, based on previous rental, I mean, you're going out and checking, and I have to too check each one of those, and sometimes the process can be lengthy because they're not getting back to you. I'm just curious at what point, do you say, gosh, they're not getting back to me, I can't make a decision?
Well, the way that my company handles it when an application is dragging out, we typically tell them our average processing time is about 48 hours. Now, quite frequently it goes over that. We try to keep in contact with that applicant or their agent as much as possible and put the ball back in their court. Listen, we've faxed your landlord, we've faxed your employer, and they're not getting back to us. And until you get that information to us, this property stays on the market, and I will accept other applications and I will consider processing them. And what I tell them is, if I complete another application while I'm waiting for you to help me get this information, I won't wait. I won't sit on this application while I wait for your stuff to come through, because I owe it to that other person to go ahead and go forward. Make sure your communication is good. Try to keep it in writing as well as verbal. That way, if they try to come back later and say, well, complain or whatever, you don't have to sit on that forever. You can go ahead and go forward. Just make sure that you put the ball back in their court. Send your faxes and let them know, I've done everything I can do. I'm going to move on and start accepting other applications. That way you're not holding up the process for your owner while you wait for some landlord. And I tell them when they bring in their application, call your landlord now and call your employer now and tell them I'm going to be faxing them. And I tell them that that's going to be the thing that's going to hold this application up the most, is because your landlord doesn't care about giving me a verification because you're moving out of their property, and your employer has a million other things to do than verify your employment. So I kind of let them know up front that this is going to be on them to help me get this information.
You mentioned you have a form you fax the employer and the landlord. Is that a TAR form, or is that just something y'all created?
Okay, so the question is, what forms do we have for employment and rental verification? Those are in the TAR application. If you print out the TAR application, it's 4 or 5 pages, and it does have an employment and rental verification form that you can use. I think the employment one may or may not be part of the application, but TAR has every form that you need. Just use the TAR forms. No reason to reinvent the wheel. Yes, ma'am?
On the TAR form on page 4, it has a place where they sign, and it has a blank where they you can fill in who is going to see this.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just the realtor, or can it also be the owner?
Okay, so the question is, when you're faxing the verification, it asks for who can have access to the information. Do you put yourself, the realtor, or do you put the owner? That's going to depend on your relationship and your situation with that owner. We as a management company, because we actually do full service management for the owners, we do not turn over applications to our owners because we feel it's too great of a risk of information being spread out everywhere. So we go ahead and just put our information, and we don't turn that over to the owner. But if you have an owner who's wanting you to just gather that information and let them make the decision, then you may need to put their name on that.
One more thing, there's a company called, it's what I use, it's called My Smart Move. It does the criminal and all the background check and the credit, and it provides all of that to you.
Okay.
So, have you ever heard of that?
I have not, but there's like a million companies, so just because I haven't heard of it doesn't mean anything.
But they provide everything to you, and then they say recommend renting and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But they provide all of that information, criminal, everything to you.
Okay.
TAR Legal Counsel has told us that only the person that orders the credit report can see the credit report. They and their broker. They are not to give the credit report to the landlord or anyone else, and that's according to TAR Legal Counsel.
I heard that.
So we have had that battle, shall we say, before.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there are 2 types of credit reports that are available through the MetroTex Association. One is a full credit report, which gives you all of the background, gives you rental history, gives you their employment, gives you criminal, as well as a credit report. And then there's one that's a plain credit report. So those 2 options do exist, and it's up to you as to which one you wish to order.
And that's through MetroTex?
Yes.
And so just kind of to bounce off what she's saying, when they ask you for the credit report, tell them you cannot give that to them. And when they try to throw a fit and tell you it's their right to get it, tell them it's absolutely not their right to get it from you. It's their right to get it from the credit bureaus. And when you send them the adverse action letter, they can use that to get a free credit report from the agency that you use to make your decision. So definitely stand your ground on that. You cannot give that to them. And just let them know what their rights are to get that report with that letter, because you're going to get that when people are mad at you. Yes, ma'am.
On a credit report, you have permission on the application to get the credit report, and then they were evicted. What legal right do you have to pull that credit report after they're evicted?
Okay, so the question is, if you have an application which gives you the right to pull their credit report and they're evicted later, do you have the right to pull their credit again? I would say no, because I think they were giving you the rights to pull it for the sakes of approving or considering them for the property. I don't think that that would extend indefinitely. So I would say no, not without a new signed disclosure. And you need to be very cautious about pulling somebody's credit without clear signature consent, because there are heavy fines for people who violate that. So I would say no. I would say that would probably be too far from, and it probably wouldn't serve the purpose of the original consent.
You have to hire somebody to locate them.
Well, and would you have to hire somebody to locate them? Probably yes. There are collections agencies that you can use to help you with that. Some collections agencies take their fee out of what they collect, so you don't have to pay anything up front. I don't know how difficult that is for an individual person or a small company to have access to something like that. Our company, obviously, being large, has access to collection services. And of course, if you go to court and evict them, your judgment will show up on the credit. The court does that. But if you want to bang up their credit on the back end for collections, then you could use a collections company for that. We've most recently used Southwest Recovery, and we've just switched to Rent Debt. Southwest Recovery is who we used before, and we've switched to Rent Debt. We haven't been using them long enough for me to tell you if I like them or not. I have no idea. We have to build them. Rent Debt, D-E-B-T. And my guess would be Rent Debt, given that that's their sole purpose, might be more accessible maybe to individual owners or smaller groups, but I didn't interview them directly, so I don't know for sure. But that would probably be your best bet if you really want to try to get them, especially if you didn't evict them and they just owe you damages or rent. That's the only way you can bang up their credit. Just make sure that however you list yourself makes it apparent that you're a landlord. That way the next person pulling their credit, if it just says Joe Smith, they're not going to know. But if you put, Joe Smith landlord or something like that, then the next person pulling is going to know that they messed around with another landlord. It's going to keep them from being able to hide. Yes, ma'am.
If you're not a full-service property management company like you are, and you're listing a property for an individual, how do you go about helping them make that decision on the applicants if you're not allowed to disclose or show them the actual credit report?
So the question is, if you are just helping do a one-time lease, not doing full-time management services like my company, how do you help them make that decision when you can't disclose the information? You would do that the same way that we do. What I do is I do it verbally and over email. I give them a rundown of all the details of the application. I tell them non-identifying, shouldn't say non-identifying. I give them information that doesn't violate federal fair housing, things that they can discriminate for, but I don't give them the things that they can. I don't give them ages, race, marital status, any of that. They don't need that information because they can't use it to make a decision anyways, and when they try to argue with that, you need to tell them it doesn't matter whether they're married or not, and it doesn't matter if you know how old they are. If you choose to approve them, you'll see their names and ages on the lease. You can't use that to make your decision, but here's what you can use. Here's their credit scores. Here's the good things I see. Here's the bad things I see. Here's their rental history for the last 2 years. They lived here. They paid this much. They bounced this many checks. They were late this many times. They've worked for so-and-so for X number of years doing this. And I don't usually disclose the employer. Technically, it's not really relevant information. I usually just say they've been working doing such and such job role for X number of years. They make this amount of money. You can give them all of that information, and that's really all they need to know. You can give them some of the specifics from the credit bureau without completely releasing everything. You just need to make sure that you give the appropriate adverse action notices on their behalf if they decline. So I try to keep it to information that I know is okay for me to discuss without actually giving away all of the specific items. I just give them generalities. Basically, I give them my opinion on what I think based off of my professional history. I think overall, by looking at this person's credit, they've paid things well, or they have a consistency of not paying anything on time. They have a foreclosure from 3 years ago, that kind of a thing. You can give them some things like that. But really, you just need to give them the risk factor and why. And if they do want to approve somebody with extra deposit, you need to make sure that they feel the deposit amount they're getting is enough to protect themselves. When they want you to give them an exact dollar amount, I don't. I make a recommendation and I say, what dollar amount in your bank account is enough to make you feel that this was an okay decision if it goes bad? Is that 2 months? If we have $2,000 in being held in security deposit, if this blows up, are you going to feel like you got enough money? Because if not, then we can't do this, or we need to ask for more money. And if you can't find a dollar amount that makes you feel comfortable, then we need to decline them. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I've been asked to send a copy of the driver's license before.
Okay, so she's been asked to send a copy of the driver's license before. I wouldn't. You're putting yourself in the position, again, that was given to you as the agent making the verifications. I wouldn't pass that information along. I would just be hands off with a lot of that stuff. If those people want that information, they need to be doing that stuff themselves.
I mean, from another agent, we were asked to send copies of driver's license.
With the application? Yes, you can ask for that. Yeah, if you're wanting to rent one of my properties and I ask you for copies of their driver's license, absolutely, because I'm going to use that to make sure that the person that's applying is really who they say they are. I'm going to want to match their date of birth and their names and all that up. But that information is not going to go any further from me. it's not going to go to the owner because the owner doesn't need that information. So yeah, you can definitely submit that. That's not unreasonable. Now, if they're wanting Social Security cards, I would not do that unless it's because there's a problem. I would make sure they're giving you a legitimate reason, just because I wouldn't want my Social Security card being passed around. Now, if they're telling you that there's a problem, their credit report's not being able to come up, or they're getting, issues, then they may have a legitimate reason to be asking for the Social Security card. And if your person is a legitimate citizen with a legitimate bureau, sometimes people have, sometimes Hispanic people have names that their credit bureaus won't come up right, and you need the Social Security card to make sure you're pulling on the right person. Then that would be a legitimate reason, but I wouldn't just readily turn over Social Security cards every time. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the requirements, whether there is a requirement to have applications stored in a locked file cabinet?
Okay, so he's asking about a requirement to store applications in a locked file cabinet. You absolutely have the responsibility to protect that information as much as possible. It cannot be left out in open sight of especially customers, people who can just be milling around your office. If you're not actively using it, you need to keep it locked up. And what I would recommend is when you're done with that paper, scan it onto your computer somewhere that is a secure location on a file server, or somewhere that you know is as secure as possible, and shred the paper copy. If you don't like doing stuff electronically, then you need to always keep it locked up somewhere secure, somewhere out of sight, behind locked doors as well. If you have a lot of real estate offices are just open and people can just wander through, keep your area closed. If you're in a cubicle where you can't keep it closed, keep it in a locked drawer where it's out of sight.
A follow-up. What if you use a home office with regular filing cabinets?
It needs to be a locked filing cabinet, because if somebody breaks into your home, your car, okay, your office, and you didn't do everything you could to protect that information, you are going to be in trouble. Now, if you did everything you could and you can prove that you did everything you could, then obviously you're going to have a little bit more of protection there. But that's one thing that I'm glad you asked that, because cars are a big one. Don't carry that stuff in your car. Get from point A to point B and take that stuff out of your car. If you need to run in somewhere, take your briefcase with you and keep it with you. Don't leave that application in the car. Don't think for a second that if somebody doesn't know you're a real estate agent, they won't break into your car to try to get somebody's information, because think about it. How often are we carrying checks and applications and offer letters and all that stuff? And your car, just because you locked the doors, does not make that secure. So don't think just because you put it face down and locked your car door that you're really protecting it. You need to keep it out of sight, number one, and on your person if you can. Yes, ma'am.
With the current situation in the economy, I'm seeing a lot of multifamily situations with applicants. How are you handling that when you have 5 adults?
Okay, so
It's a lot.
yeah, I know. I have one that has 3 families living in it right now, illegally. So the question is, in today's economy, we're seeing a lot of multi-families coming together to combine a household because the economy is awful. And how do I handle that? I would say that this is where your cover sheet with your criteria becomes very important. You can set a, how do I word this? You can have a minimum or a maximum occupant per living space requirement. I would start there. Our policy is no more than 2 persons, not just adults, 2 persons in any living space, meaning a living room, a game room, or a bedroom. That will eliminate some people. I have owners who try to throw a fit because I have a couple that comes to me with 6 kids. The only way really around that is if let's say it's a 2-bedroom home and you have a 2 occupant per living space room, then 8 people wouldn't work. But that will also protect you from your owner trying to discriminate against kids if you have that policy and you say they're not exceeding an occupancy limit. And that's just the HUD recommended. That's where we get that from. I would say, though, if it's not an issue of occupancy, if there's enough space for them and everyone qualifies, then I would say do it. But if you're talking about that many households and adults trying to combine, the chances are that they're not all going to qualify. The chances are that some of them are doing worse than the others, and that's why they're combining, and that might be your way out of it. But I had a huge house in Keller, a 4,000 square foot house, and a mom and dad and the husband and wife and their kids all lived there. It was a big split floor plan. They were all wonderfully qualified, made great income, and they were excellent tenants. But they all qualified individually. The couple and the older couple, everyone qualified. There was nothing wrong with the application. So they'll probably weed themselves out. Yes, ma'am.
What do you do with a lack of credit history? For example, somebody who's paid cash for the last 5 years, somebody who pulled their credit, there's not a score.
Okay, so the question is, what do you do with a lack of credit history? You're going to want to just handle that case by case. In the instance of college-age kids, they're not going to have a lot of credit history. That in that instance may be a greater risk. You may want to get extra deposit due to the lack of credit history, especially if they're younger. Now, if you're talking about an older person who pays cash, doesn't like to use a lot of their credit, that's where you can use all the other verifications. Do they have good rental history where they've lived all these years? Or mortgage. If they've got a good mortgage and they've got good employment and income and everything else checks out, then don't hold their lack of credit against them. If everything else is good and they don't like to use credit and they've paid everything else on time, then they're just as good as somebody with a good, perfect credit score. Yes, sir.
What does your company report and not report to the credit bureau agencies, and do you report directly or use a service?
Okay, so he's asking, what do we report to the credit bureaus, and how do we do that? My company reports evictions, number one, which the court will report the judgment on their credit, so you don't have to do that. The only other thing we report is any balance that they leave. Once they vacate the property and we determine a balance, damages, rent, utilities, whatever, we send the letter, we give them 10 days to make payment in full or to make arrangements with us. If they don't settle, we usually give them, I think my company probably gives them about 30-ish days by the time we actually get around to it. We give it to the collections company, and the collections company goes after them and hits their credit. So we don't do that direct. Now, you can do that direct with the credit bureaus, but it's a little bit more complicated to do yourself if you're not using a service. Just give them a reasonable amount of time to try to settle it with you, but just make sure you stick to whatever timeline you put in the letter. Once they've vacated, give them those amount of days and don't start turning it over before then.
Follow-up question. When you turn it over to collection agency, obviously there's lots of those that are good at what they do as a professional and lots that aren't. Does TREC or anybody have recommended endorsed vendors in the collection agency area?
Okay, so he's asking if TREC or any of those organizations have a recommended collections agency. I do not know the answer to that question. I would think probably not, because those are individual companies, but I would think you could probably look at Better Business Bureau ratings for those companies to see, do they have a good overall rating. Like I said, we used Southwest Recovery. They were pretty good, and now we're using Rent Debt. Beyond that, I don't know. You could probably also ask some larger management companies who they've had success with, but I think probably your own individual research with Better Business Bureau and those type of things would probably give you a good idea. And then find out what they charge. Will they take their fees from what they collect so that you don't have to pay them anything? You might have to pay them some kind of sign-up fee or contract fee or something, but if they're willing to take their fees from what they collect, then they don't do a good job, you're not out any money. And that's the way we do it, because we can't afford to spend tens of thousands of dollars paying some company to not collect any money. It does affect what our owners get in that the people have to pay more to pay the fee, but the way we tell it to our owners is they don't have to pay for the service. They just sit back and wait for money to come in. Yes, ma'am.
Cole, as far as multiple applications, how do you handle that? Like if you're representing a one-time landlord and basically you've got multiple applications coming at the same time.
Okay, so the question is, how do you handle multiple applications? This is a really sticky subject, and the last time I presented this, we had a lot of different opinions on it. Make sure that your criteria is set forth from the beginning, so that when people know that they're applying, they know what your policy is on multiple applications. That's the most important thing you can do. If you tell them up front, when they get mad later, you can remind them that you told them up front. The way that my company does it is, until we have a completed and approved application, we will accept other applications. But what you have to be careful about is sitting on an application. You cannot sit on an application while you're waiting to see if maybe some of these other ones come in, maybe they're better. And keep in mind that that will become obvious without you trying to the people who are waiting if it starts dragging on more than a couple of days. So make sure all your communications, keep your communications frequent, and just keep everything out in the open so they can see what you're doing. my boss tends to be of the mind that if we get 8 applications, that's better for the owner. We do work for the owner, and it is our job to get as many offers as possible. I personally stop at 2 or 3 just because I feel like if I'm taking more than 2 or 3, I'm leading on a lot of people. That's my personal experience. I've been doing this a long time. I've been yelled at a lot. The lesser people I have yelling at me that don't get approved, the better it is for me. And if you have 2 or 3 applications, the chances are at least one of them is going to be good.
You're pulling credit on 2 or 3 different people.
If they come in while we're in the processing phase, I will go ahead and accept them. So if somebody applies this morning and somebody else applies tomorrow morning and I'm still in the processing phase of this one, I will go ahead and take it. Now, if I've already gotten this one complete, I will not run that application. I'll hold it like a backup. I'll present the one that I have and tell the owner they've got to make a decision on it, and then if they decline it, then I'll go to the next one. Now, if you have an owner who wants to sit on a completed one because they know you have a backup, I tell them no. If this one already went through the complete process and submitted everything on time, they deserve to have a decision made before somebody else comes in. That's the way I think personally is the best way, just to avoid a liability of taking somebody's money without the intention of really delivering like you promised.
If you had both of them come in the same day, I use MetroTex as well to pull everything. You're not going to get stuff back until the end of the day or the next day with the updates.
Mhm.
So it would be okay to pull that second person and then just the landlord kind of make that decision based on which looks like it's the best applicant.
Yes, and that's what I tell, you need to be very careful about what you tell them up front. What I tell them is we will accept all offers that are received during the processing phase. We'll fully process every application, present all the information to the owner, and the owner will choose the best qualified applicant. That's what I tell them. And then that way they know they're getting a fair shot at it. And if they start fussing at you, what I tell them is, well, what if you were the second application and I didn't accept you because I already had one and the first one was dirt and you lost your chance at it? And most agents, they understand that plenty of times they've been the second person and didn't get a shot when they probably had the better clients. And what I tell them is I work for the owner. It is my responsibility to make sure that that owner has an opportunity to accept the best qualified applicant. Just make sure you keep your wording the same with every person you talk to. And don't go crazy and accept 10 applications.
Yeah, follow-up question. When we deny the other applicants, can we just say the owner choose the best one so the rest automatically deny?
He's asking when we deny an applicant, you're asking what do we tell the other ones?
Yeah, when we tell the ones we deny.
The ones that we decline. Okay, so what do you tell the ones that you decline when you had multiple? What I tell them is the owner has chosen the other application and why. I give them either the reasons that they were declined. I don't want to give an agent a whole bunch of specifics about a person's credit. That agent doesn't have the right to that information. You can just tell the agent they were declined for an issue with their credit, with their rental history, whatever it was that you declined for, and tell them if their applicant wants more personalized information, they can call you and you can discuss that, or if it's pertaining to their credit, they can get a copy from their credit bureau. Now, if it was because there was a better applicant and they're not necessarily a, quote, bad applicant, sometimes I will tell them, well, your person did have a few credit bumps and we had somebody who didn't have any. Now my company will turn applications to other properties, so if they don't get approved with one, we'll sometimes pitch them to another one. So if it's that case where you might want to offer them another property, you might say, listen, you were declined for this one because of credit or whatever the reason is, but you still might have a chance with another one of my properties. You might want to let them know that. If it's not a bad application, you might want to let them know, but if they're just declined and you don't have anything else to offer them, just give them a very basic reason why. If they want more information, the applicant needs to get that from you direct because the agent doesn't have a right to that information.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.